Yes, the beautiful community is here. We're going to do a little debrief on the main channel video, beautiful community. Hearing and seeing feedback, and then we'll scroll up and start. I introduced a new concept in this video that we did on the main channel, which we all must hate, but it's got its place. And that's what I've called post-truth in action. So not just post-truth in the way that unlovely political actors do something and then try to obscure it by telling you 7 different stories about it. We've discussed that so many times with Russia's explanations of what they're doing in Ukraine or elsewhere. But I then introduced an idea of post-truth in action. And you remember the example in the video. Go watch the video if you haven't yet, whereby the post-truther, right, has a particular destination. They want to go out and get a beetroot from the grocers, but instead of saying I'm going out to get a beetroot, you say I'm going to the gym. I'm gonna go for a swim. I'm gonna go to the moon. And that's post-truth in communication. But post-truth in action is when you say you're going to go to the gym, you're going to go to the moon, but actually just sort of walk around aimlessly. And then you try to, withdraw a book from a public toilet. That's when what you are actually doing, not just what you're saying about what you're doing, ceases to reference the real world. And weirdly enough, that's largely temporary peak that we're experiencing right now of this idea of post-truth in action, because as we encounter the more serious authoritarians in the 2030s, they will tendentiously gravitate around having a clear idea of what they want to do and then communicatively post-truthing about it. It's primarily in the age of post-truth authoritarian buffoons, right? It's a more Trump than an Orban type way of being in the world politically. But it's in this age that we're encountering a lot of post-truth in action and not just post-truth communicatively, right? Nigel Farage in the UK is another good example of somebody who does post-truth in action. He isn't on top of basic facts. He isn't on top of key policy issues. So it's not like there's a very clear strategy there beneath the sort of saturation of the information environment with a series of mutually exclusive lies. So funnily enough, as things get worse, the post-truth in action element among our more irresponsible politicians would actually diminish. And the post-truth in communication bit will peak again. But this is a post-truth in action war, I'm afraid, the Iran war. Okay. Hi, Vlad. What else can we expect from this new post-truth imperialism? There's a level of unpredictability to it in virtue of the fact that it is post-truth in that substantive and not just the communicative sense. So what you expect, I'm going to have to be abstract here because it's not a predictable world, but what you expect is what Trump can get away with as he continues to ever increasingly feed his need for narcissistic supply. And then you're saying, Pauli, you're saying a very nice thing about my health, how it fluctuates between terrible and bad. There's a sort of meme in the acute chronic illness community which says, yes, I'm having a bad day, as in I'm having a bad day but not a terrible one. Is Trump even capable of doing taco here psychologically? Yes, he is, as a consequence of a buildup of deleterious factors, which he is powerless to change. He's already getting angry about this, and he doesn't know what to do. He's still getting a lot of supply of the theatricity of the war. I would still say he is at least 50% supplied rather than furious, but he's beginning to get furious. It's reaching about 50%, and it could be 60, 70% if this carries on for weeks. So yes, he is, but it's really difficult for him to stop because he's gonna have to face the fact that he's crashed into a wall. And he can't square the equation of maximalist fantasy with minimal commitment. So the thing to say here is just that it's psychologically difficult for him. He is thinking about it now. Or he is maybe even thinking about doing it, but not yet ready to do it. So I think that's where he's at. It's difficult for him because it takes a very disciplined and non-impulsive decision to say, okay, at this point we have to call it a day and declare victory. What I would say is journalists, professional journalists, are helping Trump too much here. They're buying excessively into his narrative and saying things like, well, maybe given that we're not sure about his expectations here and he declares victory, maybe it could be in reference to some of his expectations being met, even though we don't know what they are. Very dangerous for journalistic institutions to do that, to allow that. I'm seeing that too much. Could you explain the title of your main video? Well, at first I titled it Why Trump is Losing the Iran War. And then just as I uploaded, I changed it to this could be the beginning of the end of Trumpism. Partly because 5,000 extra people will click on high quality content if I say that, quite frankly, and what's inside the wrapper isn't changed. Partly because substantially, that's actually a very interesting question to talk about the implosion of Trumpism, because this is plausibly indeed the beginning of the implosion of Trumpism. But what we have to understand is that it's not going to be replaced by a reversion to a democratic normal. So it's healthy already to understand that Trumpism will implode. It's healthy already to talk about the genesis of that and the mechanics of that. And this is doubly helpful to talk about because it will also teach us that there's going to be no renormalization after it. In fact, the disinhibition Trump introduces into our domestic and foreign policy will make it more likely that worse actors succeed after him. But have no doubt that Trumpism is going to implode, and have no doubts that we're seeing the, at the very least, the seeds of that now. What would be a way of objecting to that view? The way to object to it would be to say that somebody like Vance and somebody after Vance could carry Trumpism on. And that story will run aground on the fact that too much of what Trumpism is tied to the specifics of a particular personality. So even if there's a president in the 2030s who feels their work is continuous, their bad work is continuous with Trump, I would argue it's unlikely for it truly to be. So if you like, you could keep the brand, but you're going to have to dramatically change what's in the box. And so it's very difficult to see substantively Trumpism survive beyond Trump's actual political career. And that, in part, is a product of what we just said earlier, that this post-truth element will persist in the post-truth element in our politics will persist in communication, but will actually diminish somewhat in the 2030s in action. And Trump is all about post-truth in action. So the 2030s are going to bring different kinds of authoritarian threats, and there's going to be more discontinuity than continuity with Trumpism. The reason I'm sometimes careful to say this, and I got into trouble with this a bit also before the 2024 election, is that unless I constantly caveat it, it makes people think that we're going to have a reversion to a democratic normal. Oh, Trumpism is collapsing. That's the clickbait force of a lot of the really big sort of headlines, which say Trump's got 4 months to live and so on, which are bogus. But they're trading off the idea that there can be a renormalization, and there can't. You could have a partial renormalization in the sense of stabilizing democratic institutions, but it wouldn't be a return to normal. It would be a new political project stabilizing institutions. You can't go back to what Kamala Harris was offering in 2024. So that's some of how I think about that. What's the role of the public intellectual? The role of the public intellectual is different. It depends on what kind of public intellectual you are. The minor public intellectual I am means that my role in the first instance is not about telling you the truth. That's my second goal. My first goal is to contribute something in a way that might actually surprise both me and you to your relationship with truthfulness. And as a byproduct of that, to your relationship with a kind of political sanity. Because actually, one of the things that terrifies you the most at the moment is not the badness of the shit that happens, but the unintelligibility of the shit that happens. I'm confused with why the trailer is Greek. So is saying so. One of my two closest friends in the world died suddenly and prematurely at the end of 2011. I still speak to him every day. He's Greek. Since then, although not in recent years when my health entirely stopped allowing that, I spent a lot of time in Greece. And one of my favorite hangout spots in Athens used to be the new Acropolis Museum, which feels like a sort of glass-walled suspended ship floating alongside the real Acropolis. It's a very, very healthy public space. In many ways, it's at odds with the Greeks' own inadequate transparency to their own past. Weirdly enough, the Greeks as a culture right now are not good at being connected to the ancient Greece legacy, for example. Funnily enough, there are people in other parts of the West that experience that connection more constructively. And that's actually one of the things I would really work on in Greek public life. It's also a great sales pitch for Greece. It's not properly utilized. Okay, this is a tangent. But yes, I'm a very big fan of Greece. Which leads starts an interesting conversation, which we'll have. Maybe it's going to be a main channel video about this. In some ways, the south of Europe will cope better if their democracy collapses than the north of Europe. The north of Europe, even though I identify more psychologically with the north of Europe, if you look at my people I love and friendship circle, perhaps, but and in many ways, Germany is an exception, actually, because Germany has greater self-transparency. But taking it very crudely, if you take the Scandinavian countries I really love, we also have big audience in the Scandinavian countries. And I've always just had a very, very positive relationship with the Scandinavian countries. A lot of people I love are from there. But it will be easier for a Greek or an Italian or a Portuguese to say, no, what the hell? This is weird. This is wrong. When something really bad happens and their democracy has collapsed and real authoritarian stuff is going on. The Scandinavian reaction and generally the North European reaction will be more pathological. They will be more repressed and insufficiently able to access that primitive reaction of, oh, this is what the hell is that? This is wrong. They'll try to normalize it. They'll try to justify it. So funnily enough, the way the North Europeans might legitimately tease the South Europeans for being a little bit more primitive with their instincts, that primitiveness will come out more beneficially in times of crisis and democratic collapse. And it'll actually it'll be Northern Europe that will be more sick in the way it reacts to the collapse of its own democracy and in the way it denies the reality around it. And I say that as somebody who feels much more at home in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. Although, as I said, I love Greece, so this is a complex conversation. Friday the 13th, oh my God, terrible things are happening in the world. So let's not be too superstitious. By the way, you know, I grew up in the Soviet Union till the age of 9 and 10. Oh my God. The collapse of public religion in the Soviet Union sort of in part converted into an oppressive thicket of superstitions that a lot of Soviet children were burdened with. If you see that, then it means that's going to happen. If you dream of this, it means this is going to happen. Shouldn't Trump have failed harder at life if he has a narcissistic personality disorder? No. NPD is conducive to certain kinds of rapid success. We could talk about this more, but that's my answer for today. Is it unresolved collective trauma that Trump resonated with? Frederick is asking. When we talk about that line I part quoted from John Gray about how Trump resonated with the American unconscious. Partly, yes. Partly it's mysterious. And partly it's not trauma, but a product of the fact that in some ways Trump voters are acting more rationally in some ways than Biden or Harris voters, than people like you. Too many people like you are saying, we're going to keep public discourse here. This is where we are. This is where we've always been. And then everybody who goes like this is either irrational or immoral or nuts. So don't underestimate the rationality of Trump voters, in the sense that a lot of them feel that something very, very serious is very broken. And some of you don't feel that. And it's probably that Trump voters are more correct than you are. And I actually know most of you do feel that something is broken. So I'm speaking hyperbolically. I'm trying to wake up the few remnants of the beautiful community who are still in 1998. So you shouldn't underestimate how far the decision for Trump voters was also just about compromise, pragmatism, values, concerns. How do we keep politics and economics under control so that our country controls it? How do we keep it under control so that we as citizens have some kind of control over it? Restoration of control is a very important impulse in response to an understandable and in part rational perception control has been lost. To a degree that is no longer compatible, that the loss of control is no longer compatible with the sustenance of democratic polity. Right? There's genuine democratic, restorative democratic instincts in the Trump vote, right? But they are via a post-truth immersion of all of the constructive solution type thought generate catastrophic results. But a lot of the impulses are rational. It's just that in practice, it's going to hurt everybody, including the people who voted for him. So that's one thing I'm putting on the table. Grasp the degree to which the Trump vote has democratic liberatory credentials, even though the substance of any policy attached to it is Looney Tunes, and in part Looney Tunes because there is no substance. Hi, Vlad. Hope the illness isn't eating you alive too much. There's lots of metaphors like that. This isn't a terrible one. Um, could this work have been justified and viewed morally right as morally right? International law in a hypothetical universe. In international law, no. It could be right if fantasies of overreach weren't fantasies and it were in fact possible to control more of the world with intentional action than is actually possible, right? The Gertrude Bell example from the main channel video. The recent history of the West, and that is unfortunately a part, not the main, but it's a part of the cause of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, is that we ourselves haven't stuck to what was supposed to be our own principles in international policy, and that is allowed tyrants like Putin to get away more easily with bad behavior. And part of the problem for us has been that we have tried to do things that were essentially undoable. That's Afghanistan, that's Iraq in particular. So could this have been done a lot better by an alternate administration with greater preparedness, greater scenario planning, greater efficacy? Yes. Yes. Could it have been done by any alternate administration in a way that would be successful, that could sort of bridge that gap between minimal effort and maximalist outcome? That's much less plausible. What practical steps could help reduce hostility on the Arab street towards Israel's existence? Well, some of this is stuff you can't touch. It's driven by fundamentalist radicalism and ideology. Some of it is to do with what Israel actually does. And that's not a gap that can be bridged. I mean, Israel is in a very, very worrying place right now for somebody who wanted to maximize Israel's chances of being around in 2200. Because Israel's politics has been too excessively overtaken by a kind of psychopathic sense of invincibility, together with a very, very evasive sense of precarity. And that's a very difficult combination. I mean, look, most Israelis think that this is a good idea, what their government is doing. And I think that's not quite true when I say it. It's a bit of a hyperbole because you can't really box people like that. People are very multifaceted. But it's truer of Israelis than of Russians. The Russian attitude to their war is, oh, I don't know. Is anything happening? I'm going to look away. The Israeli attitude is, no, actually, I think this is good. It's closer to that. And that is, if you throw not just war, but the climate crisis into this, over coming decades, that political situation increases the odds that something really not good could happen to Israel in the next 50 to 100 years, where there could be a kind of self-destructive radicalism, self-destructive evasiveness. Even allowing for the fact that, of course, Israel is a sublime military power. It is a society with sublime ingenuity. It is a society with a very important, powerful nuclear arsenal. It's a society with incredibly special human resources, but it's also got this very problematic pathological dimension that is actually not good for Israel's safety, just purely talking about Israel, forgetting Israel's neighbors and their needs. How do you convince people who believe everything Trump says or think it's part of some larger strategy? It's very difficult to convince anybody of anything because, as a partial great hero of mine said, the greatest philosopher to come out of these isles that I'm on, David Hume, that reason is and ought to be a slave of the passions. And very roughly, if we are to capture what's meant there, it's the thought that what motivates you is what motivates you is what motivates you is what motivates you is what motivates you. I can't insert into your brain a reason that might motivate you that doesn't already motivate you because it's connected somehow with particular passions. We would need a modern translation of that term, but it's very important that very, very little argument in the real world proceeds and resolves in terms of the inferiority and superiority of the conflicting claims. Very rarely this does happen, but it needs to happen in very, very institutionally coerced contexts. An example might be peer-reviewed scientific research, or on a good day, a philosophy seminar. But it's a very coercive environment, a philosophy seminar, which, because it is so coercive and so ritualized, allows Ricky to say, oh my God, Bobby has pointed out several flaws in this paper I've just published. And actually, probably it'd been better if I didn't publish it. Or it'd been better if I had thought this through more deeply. There can be a kind of a genuine gratitude and exhilaration in not just making a partial mistake, but in being engaged with a project that's an error. Now, this can go too far. One professor of philosophy in the room that I was in was debating another professor of philosophy and said to him at the beginning of the discussion that he was the superior philosopher out of the two, and added that even the hero of that other person, who was David Hume, was a writer better understood by him than the interlocutor whose hero Hume was. So that too can descend into kind of infantilization and childishness. There's a lot of childishness in professional philosophy. When my hero Isaiah Berlin wrongly claimed he left philosophy in the 1940s, what he meant was that he had an allergic reaction in part to certain childish ways of doing philosophy. But even if you guys, you're relatively well motivated and you're also relatively unhealthily in agreement with each other, 664 of you here, if all of you start arguing, I mean, do you seriously think that the best argument's going to win? Even in our relatively benign comment section, where literally some of you are saying, oh my God, Vlad, good to see you. I really wish good things for your health, right? We're very positively disposed towards one another. We're trying to question what we think. We're in a little bit of a bubble, right? We've got probably 4 Trump supporters here out of 655 people. And yet, even if we engaged with one another, the idea that the argument that would win, if we took a vote at the end, would be a victor in virtue of its superior epistemic credentials, I think that would be naive. I think the argument that would win would be more popular for a mix of reasons. So understand how difficult it is to shift this. You can say to somebody, well, you should think this or you should do this. But that's very different to realistically expecting that they are going to think that and do this. And also very different to, in fact, realistically expecting that it makes sense to even talk about them having a reason to do something. Somebody who isn't motivated to do something doesn't have a reason to do it. You might say Trump has a reason to not start the Iran war because he has no strategy and it's counterproductive on any account of it. I don't think he does. I think he shouldn't start the war, but I don't think he has a reason not to, because the reason has got to be somehow connected with what a philosopher might call Trump's motivational set. What's motivationally occurring inside his head? I don't think Trump has a reason to not do this war. I don't think Trump has an overwhelming reason to not do this war. I'll put it like this. Um, Looks like we still have sound. People said technical or hot chocolate issues. Okay, let's do some super thanks. Did Trump just save Vance's political future by mentioning a philosophical difference regarding Iran? Sure, Vance bootlicks, but if January 6th can be forgotten, certainly that can sell well. It's Vance's project to keep a more limited profile during the Iran war. Vance is aware of this. One of the things that we tend to underestimate is how far a post-truth political discourse allows you to get away with just about anything. So don't underestimate how much, you know, redefinition an image of a politician can successfully endure in this age. If you just go through a 6-month or a 1-year transition, don't underestimate that. It feels like I didn't take all the questions from the top. Let me just make sure I take a couple of more and then I'll do super thanks. It looks like, let me see. Yeah, some questions have just gone missing. And just before I started, I did a very quick paste, so I've got a very loose document with them here. Let me see if I can find them. Could all of this be, Pineapple is asking, part of a strategy to counter China controlling its oil supply, regaining influence over strategic assets? So, on balance, China is a beneficiary of this. The damage done to China by this is sort of diffused into a carousel of all kinds of different damage, first of all. Secondly, this is the US empire, first of all, expiring its military capacity that could be expending its military capacity that could be deployed elsewhere, and acting without strategy, expending its soft power, um, burning its alliances. China waits and benefits, very, very, very roughly speaking. I know there are a few stories about this. They dramatically underestimate how much strategic thinking there is in the Trump administration. And if that's where the strategic thinking landed the Trump administration, that would be a worry too. Are the forces against us too strong to survive democratic collapse? No, they're not. Think of the survival of your democracy wherever you are in the West over the next 15 years as slightly better than a coin toss. It's a bit worse in some countries, perhaps, but it's slightly better than a coin toss. So that's a very, very good chance of democratic survival. So don't confuse democratic crisis with democratic collapse. Democratic collapse is likely to occur in some Western countries, but not in all, and maybe not in most. So it's not a loser's game. You've got a big chance here. What you can't do is completely reverse the pattern. I can't see it, but I think there was a question on state capacity. Um, what do you mean, Vlad, when you say that in the 2030s a bold and responsible politician could come to power, turn the wheels of state with nothing happening in response? What do you mean by that? What I mean by that is if various agencies of state, this is actually a really important point, if various agencies of state are degraded, if the civil service is degraded, if regulatory bodies are degraded, if proper checks and balances are degraded, if necessary institutional memory is degraded, if uh, aid infrastructure is degraded, if expertise in various institutions is degraded, if alliance structures are degraded. So um, one of the stories that's untold is how much Trumpism is an attack on US state capacity, on the capacity of the US state to operate effectively to any end at all. Um, a radical example is Putinism. Now, Putin's state capacity is really crap in Russia. Putin himself is a guy who turns the wheel in domestic Russian politics with very little happening. That is partly why he's so fond of foreign policy, partly. So this is a funny sociology and tragic sociology of authoritarian regimes. They they grind to a halt in their capacity to do anything domestically and then begin fetishizing action on the international stage. Because when Putin tries to do domestic policy in Russia, he gets into a larder, but he is suddenly in a very, well built electric car when he does Ukraine because he hits the accelerator and boom, the thing goes in 3 seconds to 60 miles an hour. And he's going to prefer that experience, to sort of downing the accelerator pedal and then, 11 minutes later, he's reached 23 miles an hour. That's how he experiences domestic policy. He doesn't like it. It's not impressive to him. Not much can be done. That's what degraded state capacity looks like. You can't do much. Oh, Mr. Putin, we have 4 problems in this region. Can you fix them? I can't. I'm fairly powerless here. I can start another war if you like, but I can't do that. We don't have enough state capacity to make changes. Um, we can create a fabrication as though we're making these changes, but actually making them might be beyond the capacity of the state. So that's what I mean. That's what post-truth authoritarian populists degrade when they're in power, and this is very important. All right, let's come back to some super thanks. What are the chances that Trump is going to go to prison for his actions? Very low. Sorry, Arthur M, for my answer. It's becoming harder and harder, and also there's a lot of virality in that message. Oh, all of these guys are going to be in jail. The psychology behind that politics risks being captured by kind of a fantasy of deliverance from the reality that we're not in 1998 anymore, and that a large percentage of the country wants to vote for politicians of a particular kind for reasons that you can't just put down to ignorance and irrationality. it's becoming harder to see how the 2026 election cycle can take place. Trump must derail it to survive. Um, there's a clear chance of a kind of constitutional crisis whereby the Trump administration says we don't like these results and therefore they're not real. Uh, apart from saying that, what will they do? So we're going to have to see. So this is an important moment on the trajectory of um, the way the United States handles its journey through these stormy waters of democratic degeneration. It's not going to be a completely existential moment, but it could be much more or much less damaging, depending on how it pans out. I'm going to skip Hage Barisic, your question about AI and how it's going to impact future societies and control employment. Partly this requires economic analysis I'm not on top of. Partly it requires a conversation that just sends me into a rant if I talk about how interaction with AI is changing our psychologies, changing the way our psychologies are expressed. And also I could get into a rant about how we tend to not control technologies we generate, that they tend to rather structure the ways our societies are organized without meaningfully the concept of choice playing a part in that. So forgive me, but I do promise to do maybe some freestanding remarks on AI. Thoughts on dependence on US digital services and weaponization against allies. Um, it's very difficult to talk about this because the European powers need to focus on sovereignty in these dimensions, but they can't just magically jump into sovereignty in these dimensions. So this needs to be a systematic and responsible process of decoupling. It's extremely doable if you get a term or two of relatively responsible functional governments, but the risk is that's not what we're going to get. We've got very dangerous election cycles coming up, and you're seeing how, just to take the UK example, the leaders of the post-truth authoritarian political forces in the UK are all behind Trump's war with Iran without any desire to analyze it. Adam Ragusi is in the house. Lovely, Adam. Good to see you. And you're just being generous without a question. Chester, when we hit the rock bottom of democratic decline, will the West be just a smattering of soft autocracies and democracies in perpetual chaos? We're probably going to hit rock bottom in about 10 years. And a best case scenario is that we are a blend of collapsed and fragile democracies. So it's important to get sort of psychologically ready for that period. It's important to not freak out, right? You're not going to be abducted by aliens. You still be able to, go to work, have a coffee in your favorite cafe. And in some cases, if you are unlucky to have your democracy collapse, you might be able to get it back. But it's still very psychically hard for us to picture this because our entire expectations make the thought that the future won't be like the recent past feel utterly catastrophic. And I think partly this is about grief, and grief takes time. I think we're a year or two away from being able to reckon with a prospect like that. But we can learn a lot. I mean, look, the Hungarians are trying to reckon with almost having lost any capacity to influence their government. That could be us, and we need to get ready for it, and we need to understand that political possibilities are always a matter of degree, and political transformation is possible even when it is really, really hard. So my strong advice is that we understand that we just will catastrophize this for the next couple of years, but that we will eventually learn to snap out of the catastrophizing and then deal with it. In the last video, I mentioned my great grandmother, who was from an aristocratic background in the pre-revolutionary Russian Empire, and these folks lost all of their possessions in a matter of weeks, and lost their property, and had to go work in factories. So radical transformations affected people across history, and why should we be exempt from this? And anyway, our transformation is not so radical. What should Marjorie Taylor Greene be doing? Look, I'd be skeptical about political entrepreneurs like Marjorie Taylor Greene, because even if they detach themselves from Trumpism, they might well ally themselves with the next authoritarian unconstructive force in our politics. So I think a better question would be, could we use the need for some like Marjorie Taylor Greene to detach themselves from Trumpism for our benefit somehow? I think that's a better question. Drew. How could someone in the administration try to curb Trump's irresponsibility? Is it even possible for someone with integrity to be in that kind of position? Basically, no. Marco Rubio is a good example of somebody who thinks that they're going to make Trumpism less bad by being in the middle of it. And I don't think it's working very well for Marco. Because, for instance, Marco's gains on Ukraine have been very, very minimal indeed. Trump has not been a friend of Ukraine. So if one were near Trump, what would one do? One would be very, very assertive. Trump hates confrontation in personal life. It would be way more effective for a European leader to call Trump one-on-one, not in public, and tell him off. Trump is bullyable fairly easily and manipulable fairly easily. You can't push Trump around by calling him and saying, "What the hell do you think you're doing? What is this? It's disgraceful. These are the two things I'm going to do now. You're going to deal with them." Understood? It's shocking how easy it is to manipulate Trump. And it's shocking how easy it is to, even from a position of asymmetrically, reduced power, to push him around. Unfortunately, one of the worst leaders on earth to actually do that in practice is my Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This is just not Keir's ballpark at all. Keir would never know where to begin doing this. Macron can be closer, but he still can't do it, doesn't do it. It requires boldness. It requires confidence. Churchill would probably do this with Trump. You would be, and I'm not saying that Churchill was a resplendent historical force in every way. He was a political yo-yo, implicated in all kinds of glory and loveliness. But a great, great prime minister, one of the greatest leaders this country has had, particularly as wartime leader. And he would push Trump around, even allowing the fact that the UK barely has a functional submarine, the UK barely has a functional aircraft carrier, the UK military Once you stop looking at it on paper and you actually ask, well, what's what here in practice, and how much of this stuff is actually operational, it looks really embarrassing. But you could push Trump around quite easily. The degree to which, from a position of power, you can tell him no is dramatically underestimated by people. What you then have to do is you have to ally with him on 2 or 3 important political moments and make him feel that his relationship with you benefits him. So it might be, Donny, you did that 2 or 3 times last week. Don't do that. It'll be more effective to do that. He'll be, oh yeah, all right, I'll do that instead. If you talk about process, if you talk about how to manipulate the information environment, that is actually something he can learn. There's very little he can learn, but to do better the stuff that he does anyway, in the way he does it anyway, that he can learn. So he's open. He's open to being pushed around, and nobody's doing that. Nobody's doing that. And it's a consequence of the lack of gravitas of other world leaders right now, and the consequence of the fact that not enough people have clear experience of how to manipulate people with narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder people are very difficult to negotiate with. You can't get them to quite settle on any fixed negotiation. They always push boundaries. So you can't set boundaries with them. You can't tell Trump, Don, you're not going to cross this boundary. And if you do, these consequences will follow. You can't do that with him easily. But what you can do, absolutely, is manipulate him. He's fairly easily manipulable. I mean, Putin is absolutely terrible at manipulating Trump, but he can still do it, even though he's pretty terrible at it. And Trump acts very submissively with him. And it's not because he's a Russian asset, it's because Putin can push him around, even doing it in a kind of a low skill way. So this is much underestimated, much underestimated. You can also take a very strong stance against Trump doing something, go quite far pushing him against it as a way of making him change one element of it without him changing the whole thing. So there's plenty of room for that. Nobody's exploiting it. Let's run 8 more minutes. We'll be shorter today. Rach is asking 2 questions. Could Miliband be prime minister? No, neither of the Milibands could ever be prime minister in the UK, realistically, unless something dramatic happens in the way they reframe their entire image. You can do that, but neither of them are doing it, and so until they do it, it's not going to be possible. Hungary, Rachel, is going to be a sort of historical meditation on what extent of institutional capture is sufficient to make it possible to stay in power even if you lose an election. So this is going to be a very interesting historical experiment. And the answer very often is that it's contingent. Even as late as the early 2010s, for instance, in Russia, it was possible, virtually impossible, but still just about possible, to dislodge Putin. Has conservatism been hijacked by post-truthers? Just as asking, yes. There's very little conservatism left in Western public discourse. And we should treasure the bits of it that are really left. Constitutional conservatives are very welcome also here in our community, because they are pro-institutional, basically, and you got to keep the institutional game going. If your institutions collapse, you're cooked. And unfortunately, too many people have, in a very deceptive way, even self-deceptive way, often just changed, and they are ex-conservative authoritarians in conservative clothes. So that's very damaging. So we have lived through a kind of, if you like, strange death of conservatism, whereby lots of people are pretending to be conservatives, but in most cases, they're not conservatives anymore. I mean, there's very little conservative about Farage or the AFD or Trump. They are anti-institutional authoritarian revolutionaries. Okay, 5 minutes, a couple of more questions. Julia, thank you so much for congratulating me on the main channel video. As you've noticed, I'm doing it from bed for health reasons, and it's also much less edited now. But I hope this allows me to be more frequently present on the main channel. What if you're a drama queen around Trump? Can you push Trump around that way? Alex is asking. That's partly one of the things that's available in that palette I was discussing, simply because Trump does not like conflict. He's able to say, all right, fine, we're not going to do that. He's absolutely able to do this. But it has to be joined by a kind of giddy, involved conspiratorialism that takes his side. So it's a difficult act of manipulation, you know? You have to be able to say stuff to Trump like, well, you've done this thing I don't agree with, but here's a way you can do it better than you're doing it on your own terms. That also can win Trump over and then allow you to push him without him completely flipping out. And also, don't panic when he loses his shit at you and expect a reset. And you can even accelerate this. Okay, you've lost your shit at me. Now you're going to snap out of it. Because I'm going to ask you very nicely. And I'm going to say 4 or 5 nice things about you. And then you're going to suddenly think, oh, okay, I've heard nice things about me. So he called me and he said some nice things to me very strongly. Okay. I mean, this is a lot more doable than unfortunately our political leaders are demonstrating at the moment. Mick, you do a great Trump impersonation. Somebody I love said to me how terrible I am at impersonations. And so the point of my Trump impersonation is that it's deliberately meant to be the worst impersonation in the world, that yet still somehow captures the farcical nature of his psychology. Post-truth, Iserion, has taken so much hold, quite rightly, as you say, maybe it's the wealth gap, is it the social media landscape? Yeah, you're reaching for social force type explanations. So that's where you go. So one way to go is to say it's because people are dumb and less rational. Another way to go is that it's driven by social forces. The problem is that people could have become more dumb and less rational because they're pushed around by certain social forces. But then it'd be the social forces that underlie this. And so I don't want to say that there's nothing interesting to be said about how we're all dumber and we can't keep two things in mind anymore. We just do one. I don't want to say that there's nothing to that. I often talk about that myself, but that's not where we start. When we talk about Trump voters, my Instagram, I'm rarely on Instagram, but follow me there because I do want to post there more. When I'm on Instagram, I see a lot of political videos basically calling out Trump voters as dumb. And I think that's not just a political mistake, it's an epistemic mistake. In other words, it's the crisis of trust that comes first and the post-truth misinformation environment that comes second, not the other way around. Most people online still do it the other way around. We're in this collapse of trust because we haven't corrected enough falsehoods or whatever in our information environment. Somebody's saying, Johan, that's a good question. What is Johan's question? Do you think Trump is capable of dropping a nuke on Iran if all else fails? So the answer is yes, as far as his own disposition goes. As far as whether he'll be able to force it through, that's a separate question. What I would say is that level of escalation of his need for narcissistic supply, if we put this psychologically, is not where we are today. It's where we risk being by the end of his term, because he needs to reach for ever bigger stuff. But we're not there yet. So he can't just do that overnight. If we're in a place where he can do that, you would already see in various kinds of dramatization and escalation from Trump in the sort of ballooning of his need for ever larger bits of theatricity. You're going to see this. You're going to see this. So it's not going to happen overnight. So the answer is no, but he could escalate and be capable of stuff he isn't capable of yet in the coming couple of years. People are saying they're using Adam Ragusia's recipes. It's a very small world, isn't it? Okay, we're going to do last two questions. Hurricane, I don't think Giorgia Meloni can push Trump around. Age Baristic, thank you. How Western supporters of the Israelis and Palestinians confused about mutual motives and so on. I'm really delayed with this, but I promise I'm going to do a sort of hour, 2 hour, especially ethically grounded deep dive on this in the coming week or two, probably on the chat channel. The UK's position, if Nigel Farage wins the next election, would be that he can still get voted out in the election after. So UK democracy is likely to survive this. Can Zelensky manipulate Trump? Absolutely not. He doesn't remotely have the language or the skill set to do this. And if anything, Zelensky has had to get training from other Western governments on this. My government has helped his administration to deal with Trump better. One of the terrible things that Zelensky got caught up in is his disposition that everything can be worked out once you're in the room. And that comes from the communicative spontaneity that is of the essence of Zelensky. Because don't forget, unlike you, I've been aware of Zelensky long before his political career. And one of the things that he feels is, screw it. Whatever is the situation out there, I could just walk into a room and make sure it gets worked through in virtue of my engaged, charismatic presence. That helped Zelensky a lot on the stage. But he has repeatedly found himself caught out for this arrogance in big politics. He's learning this now. He's learning this. But it was one of the problems he suffered in the first months of the Trump presidency. He was overconfident about how he could just get into a room and say, come on, man, look into someone's eyes and make progress. And then he realized, I can't do that. Um, and on top of that, there's the language barrier too. He is. You can feel some of Zelensky's charisma in English, but you can see how he finally does what I'm doing right now for reasons of brain inflammation. I'm choosing words that come easily rather than words that I want to use. But it's much more so with Zelensky. When he speaks English, he's really reaching for the word he knows. And so he's very restricted like that. Um, and so even when he feels comfortable, he struggles to take communicative ownership of the space because of that. Okay, I've taken quick fire ones. Let's do a couple of more. Mamdani is better at manipulating Trump, yes. And Mamdani is also, even though he's not brilliant, but he understands that you can both cozy up to Trump while pushing against him in other dimensions. That works. Whereas the position of almost all European leaders is, oh, no, okay, I'm going to go like this, and maybe I'll go a bit like this. But if you tell me to go like that, whoa, never, because then Donny's going to get angry at me. So, yeah, I'm not saying Mamdani is doing this well, but he's doing it much better than most. Well needs to be judged relative to what's possible. And also, I just think you need to practice pushing back against authoritarians to get better at it. That's itself a human activity in politics. It's one way of doing politics. So you need to practice it. And you're not going to practice it if you sort of say, well, I'm not going to get on my bike unless the support wheels are attached on the side. Adam says there's such a profound observation about the trust crisis coming first. Profound, but also obvious, almost obvious, right? I think what's important about that observation, Adam, is that it's hard for us to kind of psychologically accept it because we want to think that it's caused by people being bad or making a mess of the way they think about the world. Um, we are extremely passionate in the West about the notion that bad things are contingent rather than constitutive. And that put together with the relative optimism of our image of the future because it's based on our image of the recent past, that makes this fairly accessible point harder to grasp. But I think that as we deal with our grief about what's happening over time, we will get a lot better at it. Do authoritarian movements succeed because they offer existential meaning, while hyper-neoliberalism often only offers procedure? So hyper-neoliberalism is what the authoritarian movements are. Technocratic neoliberalism is not hyper-neoliberalism. It can just morph into it or generate it. So that's the way I use that term and distinction. I think that it's even less than that. They don't offer much meaning. They offer a bit of a semblance of certainty and safe ground. They give people something to cling on to, that they're not just floating out at sea, disorientated and powerless without any capacity to inflect their own trajectory. So it's just, oh my, I can cling to something solid. And that's just important for us to also empathize with. Let's not just berate people who want to cling to something solid and do it in an unconstructive way. We need to show a little bit of democratic love toward these people. Because a lot of them are saying, this political candidate allows me to cling to something solid. Don't take it away from me. And when you try to take it away from me, it makes me feel that you're an enemy and I want to destroy you. And us being greeted with that response suddenly makes us feel, well, they're saying that we're our enemy, and so that we're their enemy, and so we should treat them like our enemies too. Well, that's not the most effective approach most of the time. So we need to work on our sort of physiological capacity to grasp the democratic credentials of votes for candidates that in practice are going to destroy democratic institutions. Florian is missing discussions of how you slow down the ship. I think I have under invested in those, and I'll do more. Having said this, the first step is being truthful about the pattern, because a lot of us are in denial about it. And not being in denial about the world around us keeps citizens safe, and that's already good for democracy. But it's not just about being good for democracy, it's just about being good for mental health and being good for a vaguely truthful wherewithal. So that's where we start. And then there are two kind of paths where you have a division of labor. Do you focus on mitigation of shit hitting the fan, or do you focus on not being broken mentally by shit hitting the fan and being ready for that? And my minor public contribution will always be more on that latter, but I will up the degree of the former. And I want to do a main channel video very briefly on what would a responsible but highly electable political candidate look like? Like what's that going to be? Because I think you're right to say, well, Vlad, hang on. You're calling Trump a post-truth calamity. You're then saying that, people like Gavin Newsom are not quite it unless they evolve. How do they need to evolve? What exactly do they need to do? What do they need to say about immigration or the economy or the climate crisis or foreign policy? And I think that's a brilliant question, and I want to be more substantial in answering it. Brian is saying, can you do something with Ksenia Turkova? So Ksenia is a US-based Russian journalist with a big background in Ukrainian media, Russian media, I think. And her YouTube channel is small because she only spends a little bit of time on there. I'm sure we could. I think Ksenia and I texted maybe 3 years ago saying maybe we'll do something. Early in the war, actually, Ryan Macbeth was always generously directing traffic to Ksenia's channel. Does post-truth mean liar? Again, I prefer to say that's not how we should think of it, because if I'm going to have a hot chocolate and I'm lying about it, I'm going to tell you I'm having an Earl Grey tea. If I'm post-truthing about it, I'm going to tell you my cup is empty, I'm having a coffee, I'm not having anything at all, and I'm having a freshly squeezed beetroot juice. The aim of the first, of the lie, is to make you think that something is true that isn't. The aim of the post-truth communication is to make you feel that the very difference between truth and lies is undermined. So lying is a truth-anchored activity, the way post-truthing is not. Is the incoherence and contradiction in uh, uh, um, just a feature of Trumpism or a general feature of post-truth populism? It's absolutely a general feature of post-truth populism. Follow the discourse of other examples of the same kind of politician. Trump, because of his significant personality challenge, takes it much further. But very roughly, you're going to see the same sort of thing. I have a hot chocolate and a beetroot juice and no cup at all, and then you know that's how they work. And for now, they are also doing what I have called post-truth in action, not just post-truth in communication. Vlad, a lot of people will be impacted and already have been by the USAID cuts. Who is responsible? Everybody involved with the Trump administration, but also, of course, US citizens have a responsibility for that, not because they're causally implicated, but because you're implicated by association if you're an American citizen. What they've done with USAID, and some people I love very, very deeply, work in areas that are connected with USAID funding. Some people I love, lead organizations that depend on that funding. Some of my consulting clients, a tiny bit of my the consulting that I do, tiny amount of consulting that I do, are dealing with huge existential professional challenges about how they contribute politically because the carpet's been pulled under their feet by the USAID cuts. And the practical effect of it has been a kind of a diffuse global humanitarian catastrophe. Last question. Does it work to block Western-oriented propagandists from Russia on YouTube? It depends who you're blocking. If you're blocking essentially a functionary of the Russian state, then yes. If you're blocking some kind of adjacent intellectual entrepreneur, like Dugin, that's more debatable because we might gain more from exposure to sunlight of what he's got to come up with. That's up for debate. But is it effective to block people who basically just work for the Russian government? Yeah. Any kind of inorganic participation in the information environment you can block, and then you can debate where that boundary sits. But it's sometimes also important to listen to enemy perspectives of what is happening in your culture. They can illuminate certain things. I mean, one of the paradoxes of Dugin, for example, is that he is more awake to the mechanics of democratic decline in the West than somebody like Keir Starmer is. Only the difference is that all these things that might be going wrong for us are things that Dugin welcomes, and we want to stop them. But listening to him articulate these terrible things he wants to happen to us could actually help us prevent them. His insight is shallow enough, and it's completely just replaceable. But the principle is there. You don't necessarily want to completely cut off organic organic discourse like this by our political and cultural enemies, if you like. Being focused on the particular ways they want something to go wrong for us, they can bring us closer to thinking about these things ourselves, while taking the practicality of it in the opposite direction. All right. Thank you so much. Lots of love. See the main channel video if you haven't seen it, and talk to you very, very soon, beautiful community. Bye-bye.